Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar, Mapping Nature-Based Solutions for Climate Resilience, Developing Potential Implementation Actions, brought to you by the Nature Conservancy of Massachusetts on behalf of the SNEP Network. My name is Leah Soloway, and I'm a policy assistant with the New England Environmental Finance Center and a member of the SNEP Network. The Southeast New England Network is a collaborative group of technical assistance and training experts based in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, with a focus on how to finance and implement stormwater and watershed management efforts. The network is supported by EPA Region 1 with a far-sighted vision to build resilient ecosystems and connect communities through action, collaboration, and innovation. The network's mission is to empower communities by building local capacity to achieve healthy watersheds, sustainable financing, and long-term climate resilience through stormwater and ecological restoration projects. To learn more about or request network services, SNEP communities can visit our online portal on the SNEP Network website and fill out the request form for technical assistance. Our network liaisons, Kimberly Groff of Massachusetts and Elizabeth Scott of Rhode Island, will get in touch to discuss your request in greater detail. For all other questions, please contact us through our website, snepnetwork.org. Before we begin the presentation, I want to draw your attention to the GoToWebinar questions dialog box. Please type in your questions at any time during the webinar. My colleague, Tess Clark at Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center will be monitoring the questions. There will be a question and answer discussion at the end of the webinar. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today, Sarah Burns. Sarah Burns is a water resource scientist with the Massachusetts chapter of the Nature Conservancy, which is a network partner. Sarah works with a range of partners and technical experts around Massachusetts to plan, fund, and construct nature-based solutions to improve water quality, reconnect aquatic ecosystems, and reduce natural hazard impacts. Sarah is a certified MVP service provider and has a master's in environmental science from Indiana University. Thank you so much, Sarah, for being here today, and I will hand things over to you.
Thanks, Leah. I am sharing my screen now. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for registering and joining us this afternoon. I'm excited to talk with you today about Massachusetts's Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program and really focus my talk on a web-based decision support tool that the Nature Conservancy has developed to help fast-track nature-based solutions focused on climate resilience in Massachusetts. I'll just note the logo on the bottom left of the screen is the Massachusetts State Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. That's the state entity that runs Massachusetts' Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. And they've been very closely involved in the development of this tool. So let's, advance my screen. Here we go. Okay. So I wanted to take a minute up front and just acknowledge that when I was looking at the registrations, there were quite a few folks registered from not only not Massachusetts or Rhode Island, but all around the country, it kind of looked like. So I want to spend just a few minutes to sort of set the stage about what the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, or MVP program, is. It is a state and local partnership that was designed starting in 2016 and launched in 2017 to build resiliency to climate change across the 300+ municipalities in Massachusetts. So the program exists in two phases. There's distinct funding tracks for planning grants and certification. And you can see on the left side of my screen, there's folks gathered around a table. And that is representative of the Community Resilience Building Workshop, which is a workshop that's put on in each municipality who gets this funding and they gather together and they learn a little bit about climate change, and they spend the whole day working together around maps of their community, thinking strategically about how climate change is going to impact the natural hazard experiences in the town, in the sectors of infrastructure, society, and the environment. And it's a very interactive day, and the community's members identify their own strengths and vulnerabilities across town to different natural hazards. And then they develop action items to address either fixing weaknesses or vulnerabilities or bolstering strengths. And then the second phase of the program is called the action grant phase, and that is a phase that's specifically dedicated to funding implementation of the priority actions that come out of this process. And I think that one of the questions that came in ahead of time actually was, how do you mobilize local communities and share scientific information with them? And I think that the MVP program has struck a nice chord for that in Massachusetts, and has developed quite a lot of community engagement around what is kind of a technical scientific process of climate change impacting natural hazards. So myself or EEA or many others could give a whole webinar about how you do MVP and how it started. So I'm not going to do all of that, but I just wanted to acknowledge that right up front. I also wanted to say right up front that in Massachusetts, the MVP program is currently accepting applications for municipalities to both get planning grants, so to have their community resilience building workshops, and to you can also apply right now for action grants. So that's to implement priority actions from your report. And there's links in the slides, and the slide deck will go out in the next day or so for you all to have and look through. So anyone in Massachusetts, whether you're in the program or not, now's the time to think about if you can encourage your municipality to get involved. So this is a map showing the coverage of the program since its inception in 2017. About 82% of the municipalities in Massachusetts have received funding through the program. So soon, 82% of Massachusetts will at least have a planning report. And the program has also funded about $28 million in implementation for action items. And I think it's very interesting. I track this kind of on my own. 54 of the action grants that have been funded are nature-based solutions projects at some phase of the program, and even more than that, 65 projects, which also it can be inclusive of the nature-based solutions project, focus on hydrology or watershed management, which I think is great. So this is sort of turning into a really interesting program where it's kind of ground up development of projects and priority actions, and it's going so far so good. I also wanted to note that Rhode Island has developed a very similar program. I'm less familiar with that program, but I know there are folks in the Technical Advisory Network who are very plugged into it. If that's of interest to anyone on the webinar, I believe they call it the Municipal Resilience Building Program, and I think it's funded through the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank. And they did one round of planning last year, and I believe they have some plans to do more work with a very similar framework using the same workshops. So that is something to look into if you're in Rhode Island. In Massachusetts, the MVP program prioritizes nature-based solutions for implementation funding. And this is the definition of nature-based solutions that is used in the MVP program, and you can see that it's a very broad definition. It ranges from protection of existing natural resources and open space, through restoration of degraded ecosystems, and then all the way out to management. So incorporating natural services or features into the built environment, like stormwater management projects. The MVP program also has, it supports a range of outcomes. So the program started with a strong emphasis on natural hazard resilience. And after a few years of hearing from the communities about what their priorities are, the definition has broadened a little bit to include public health, clean water, and carbon sequestration, which is great. The program, it tries to be responsive to what's coming up from the municipalities. So the rest of the time today, almost, basically, I'm going to talk about these Siting Nature-Based Solutions maps. And these maps were developed to help support the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, to help municipalities understand where opportunities for nature-based solutions overlap with natural hazards, and to help them sort of think spatially about where a project might get them the most bang for their buck. Essentially. This project was developed first as a pilot in partnership with the Charles River Watershed Association, and has now been taken statewide through collaboration with the MVP program in Massachusetts. So the goals of these maps at a slightly more granular level are to look at 3 categories of hazards. So we look at inland flooding, coastal flooding, and drought, and to overlay with those the nature-based solutions opportunities of conservation, restoration, and management. We have made these maps using existing statewide data layers. So we didn't do any independent modeling. We didn't take any climate projections and downscale them spatially. We wanted to develop maps that could be used to help communities understand and access nature-based solutions without waiting for all of that spatial modeling, which of course is very important. But instead, these maps rely on the approach of looking at where existing hazard footprints are and thinking about how they might intensify or grow with a climate change adjustment. So I am gonna walk through a few examples of MVP priority action items and just sort of play around with the map a little bit. I'm not going to drive it live because I don't totally trust that I wouldn't crash the computer, but I'll share some screenshots. But I wanted to note that these maps are currently online at the website across the top of the screen. This is kind of a temporary home for them with a Nature Conservancy platform. At some point, the plan is to incorporate them into the Resilient MA website, which is kind of a climate clearinghouse to support the MVP program. But for now, this is where you can find them. And I also wanted to note that we plan to shuffle the data around a little bit in the map. All of that will happen on the back end. So if you're really excited about this and you dig into it and you start to get to know how things are organized, that might change in the next month or so, but almost all the content will stay the same. And I also wanted to mention here that if you are interested in using the information in these maps for the MVP Action Grant application that's live right now, that I'm happy to consult as I can. So you can feel free to shoot me an email. And the GIS manager at the Nature Conservancy is also available for consult, and she's able to package up the actual GIS data and share it in an offline version if that would be preferable. So feel free to reach out for that. So you access the content in the maps by hitting that go button. And this is my worst slide, I promise. I wanted to share this just to give an overall sense of the architecture and content of the online maps. I'm not going to walk through all of these like layers and content. I'm only going to touch on what's relevant to the examples that were submitted. But just to give a sense of everything that's out there, we have information about biodiversity. We have a folder about conservation opportunities for drought, inland flood, and coastal resilience. And we have a package of restoration opportunities and management opportunities. And then we also have mapped the projected footprint of the 3 hazards that I mentioned already, which is drought, inland flooding, and coastal flooding. I did also want to highlight one thing that is definitely going to change in the online viewer that I was hoping would be ready today, but it's not, is how we handle the areas for salt marsh migration. So that will be its own layer when we get to reorg. Right now, it's kind of incorporated into a couple of different priorities. So don't worry too much about what that means, except for if you're really excited about salt marsh migration opportunities in the short term, just shoot me an email and we can get you the GIS layers, because you won't be able to find that online yet. So now what I'm going to do is walk through, as I said, a couple of priority actions that get developed in the MVP planning process, and think about how you could use the maps to refine the priority action a little bit. And I've sort of mocked up some conceptual work plans. Almost everything I'm going to talk about, I think, everything I'm going to talk about is just my spin on it. I didn't collaborate with any municipalities in developing this. I just sort of wanted to test run how this works. And the MVP planning reports are all available online. So you can go to the state government website and grab them and look at people's priorities, which this is super nerdy to say it out loud, but it's kind of fun for me. So that's what I'm going to do. I also wanted to pause again and say that I'm really grateful for everyone who submitted their interests ahead of time relative to what hazard you're interested in and what nature-based solution opportunity you'd like to see me talk about today. I'm not going to have time to do every iteration of what was requested, but I am going to try to touch on, I think, most of the categories that people raised, and I probably won't hit every geography that was requested either, but if your geography was left out and you have a burning question, again, feel free to get in the maps and contact me if you need to. So this first example is from southeastern Massachusetts. The shot that you see on your screen is the map that was used in the planning process. You can see all the little yellow dots indicate a priority area that either is a strength or a vulnerability, and that might have an action item attached to it. And these 3 communities in southeastern Massachusetts share a sole source drinking water aquifer. And they got together, each community planned on their own, and then they got together to make a regional addendum to their plan, so to elicit regional priorities for all 3 communities. And one of their priority regional actions was to work to retain and enhance the recharge capacity of the aquifer that they all drink from. So I wanted to explore that priority action using the online map. So the first thing that makes me think of is looking at the drought hazard, which is mapped across the whole state. We know that all of Massachusetts is susceptible to drought. We saw that in 2016. But to think about how climate change and future temperature changes might impact drought susceptibility, what we did for these maps was to look for areas that are vulnerable to the effects of drought, because either groundwater recharge is compromised by a greater than 10% impervious cover, or there's indicators of groundwater withdrawal. And we looked at 2 different data sets for that. We looked at the Sustainable Water Management Initiative categories and also wellhead protection zones. We have 2 categories of drought hazard here. We have drought hazard present, which means that at least one of the criteria is met. And then we have drought hazard great, which means that it's an area where the catchment has greater than 10% impervious cover and at least one indicator of groundwater withdrawal. So we look at the drought hazard. And then to help these maps push ideas towards actions, we have conservation layers for drought resilience. So this set of information identifies areas that are currently unprotected and undeveloped, and in the case of drought resilience, can provide water resources for human use and ecosystem health. So I'm realizing now there's a lot of green on that upper inset, but we also have two categories of conserve for drought resilience. One is we call the conserve for best aquifer recharge potential. And oh, I forgot to mention this. In developing these maps, we met extensively with experts around Massachusetts in the fields of drought and flood management and nature-based solutions and restoration, and also with the folks who have helped work on the OptiTooled stormwater management approaches at EPA. And we were advised, and I have a resource I can share with this if anybody wants it, that upland C soils, hydrologic soil group C, are areas that provide an outsized recharge capacity to an aquifer because of their condition. So that's our best aquifer recharge potential category. And we also have good aquifer recharge potential, which is hydrologic soil groups A and B, also, yeah, unprotected, undeveloped lands within the drought hazard layer. And then finally, finally we have Restore for drought resilience, which I'll touch on in more detail later, but we focused for this product on stormwater remediation where site conditions indicate that water could be infiltrated to manage stormwater. And then the last thing I would look at in thinking about this, especially through the lens of conservation opportunities, is looking for biodiversity co-benefits. So we have two categories here as well. We have high quality habitat, which is developed by overlaying a couple of different data sets that are available, again, statewide in Massachusetts. Biomap 2 is only in Massachusetts, but the TNC resilient sites for conservation, I believe, exists for New England. So we have either high quality habitat or areas that have a high flow potential that can connect pockets of high quality habitat. So those are sort of the two tiers. So that's where I would look in the map to think about that first, that priority action item of retaining recharge capacity in the aquifer. And when you turn on those layers, the conserve for drought resilience and the biodiversity co-benefit, you see there's a couple of, there's opportunities for both good and best aquifer recharge potential in this 3 municipality setting, and also opportunities for conservation for high quality habitat co-benefits. So that's as far as the maps get you, but then you can imagine that in developing the planning report, you have relationships with municipal officials and things like that, and maybe in conversation or just knowledge of the area, someone points out that this opportunity on the map has a high likelihood of being conserved. Maybe the homeowner or the property owner is looking to sell. So then in that case, building on the MVP planning report and applying the maps and then reviewing the maps with some local expert knowledge, you can imagine developing a work statement along the lines of you'd like to pursue a grant to conserve land with the best aquifer recharge potential and biodiversity in Norton and Easton for drought resilience and regional habitat connectivity. So we've added a little specificity to that priority action. So that is one example. And I'm just going to keep rolling through. So the next example was requested to look at stormwater and drought resilience for Mendon, Massachusetts. And so I just popped into the MVP webpage and I pulled out their planning report. And lo and behold, a high priority short-term action item was to adopt and implement low impact development, thinking about reducing impervious surface and managing stormwater. So with that level of information, I poked around the report a little bit more and found that the consultant had included a map of the water supply and aquifer areas in Mendon, which is great. And so now I'm gonna think about how to apply the map product again. So thinking about our management layer, we have a package of stormwater restoration opportunities. So this broad footprint looks for pervious land uses within 200 feet of developed land. So within a buffer area of uses that are likely to generate stormwater. And then we used some information that we pulled out of some of the OptiTool and stormwater modeling information that exists to delineate what kind of slope and what kind of soil types we might want to screen for. So I just want to reiterate here that we didn't do any flow path modeling, and we're not even looking at topography. So this is a first feasibility step for just what do the maps tell us about slope and soil and proximity to development. Then within the opportunity for stormwater management, we have overlaid two sets of information. So we also have the inland flood hazard, which is one of the categories in the maps. So this is a layer that has quite a bit of information in it. Again, following the school of thought that if we don't have modeled downscaled climate projections, what we can do is look at conservative estimates for flood impacts from a couple of opportunities. So we include existing maps. So we have the FEMA floodplain. We have both the 100-year, which is regulatory, and the 500-year, which is that sort of currently maybe conservative, but potentially likely future scenario. And we have two modeled floodplains. We look at the active river area and then a model that's called Fathom, which is another resource that I could follow up with if anybody wanted. This is a modeling exercise looking at all stream orders 1 and above in the coterminous United States. And then we have current wetlands and surface waters with a 100-foot buffer and converted wetlands with a 100-foot buffer. So those things all together we're showing as a conservative estimate of what climate altered floodplains might look like in a given area. And for the priority of stormwater and drought, we would again look at the footprint of the drought hazard. I'm not going to walk through all of the details on that one again. So now coming back to this MVP map and thinking about the priority, I just sort of am going to draw a circle right around the center of town where we see that there's wellhead protection areas. It's kind of adjacent to the low yield aquifer, and I know it's I think it's where there's a campus in town. So taking a look, this is you can see on the left, it's kind of small, I know, but this is sort of the interface for the online maps. Once you click go and you get in there and you start looking around, I turned on the imagery based map. So this is zoomed in on that part of Mendon. And then when I overlay the stormwater management opportunities, we have 3 different opportunities present. So we have a lot of that like yellowy orange, which is based on the site information that we can glean from these statewide layers, that there's a potential for infiltrating with existing soils, which is an indicator that you could potentially do practices here to alleviate both flooding and drought. The light purple is a potential retention opportunity. So that is a soil group type that drains less well. So you have a different set of tools in the stormwater management toolbox to look at. So you would think of those probably primarily as being opportunities to remediate flood. And then finally, we have potential retention opportunities, but in red, we have this contaminated soil area. So that is an indicator that if you did decide to do a stormwater management project in contaminated soils, you should expect that the price might go up or will go up. So again, sort of thinking about how you combine the priority action with the information that you can get out of these online maps and just generating a potential work plan sentence. You could try to get some funds for concept planning, for stormwater management, for flood and drought remediation. You would need to be careful that you're following all wellhead zone 2 protection requirements in your planning. And you'd also want to take a look at flow paths and potential pollutant loads and site conditions. So you'd want to walk around for sure. And develop nature-based solutions stormwater management plan for design and engineering. And for this one, I have a couple of relevant case studies just to help think about where something like this has happened. This was not funded by the MVP program, but Franklin, Massachusetts has a drought remediation program that consists of a few different tiers of action, including a residential rain garden project. So helping people think about getting that water back into the aquifer. And if you do keep the, have the slides and you choose to look around, I have a link to the project page for this in Franklin. And then just another example for places that have been thinking along these lines. This was funded by the MVP program as an action grant. This is Natick, Massachusetts. They developed a plan for tree planting to mitigate both stormwater runoff and heat islands. So there's another potential case study to check out. So moving along to a different example, I had a few people were interested in coastal projects and coastal nature-based solutions. So this first example is outside the SNEP region. It's up in Winthrop, Massachusetts. But in their MVP report, they called out that they wanted to look for opportunities for nature-based solutions for stormwater and flood control. So again, thinking back to the maps, this is a coastal flood hazard in Winthrop. I think that's all from a Category 1 hurricane. That's what we're using in the maps right now is NOAA's SLOSH models for Category 1 and 2 hurricanes. I do want to note that the Massachusetts Department of Transportation is working hard with the group that did the developed the models for Climate Ready Boston that have pretty sophisticated looks at past storms and tidal extent, and it's a probabilistic model of flood impacts, and that will be ready for the Massachusetts coast sometime in the near future. And so those maps will take the place of these NOAA SLOSH maps when they're ready. But anyway, for now, we've got Category 1. And then we look at this coastal adaptation opportunity, which is an opportunity to store floodwaters. So in this case, what we screened across the footprint of the coastal flood hazard for was developed open spaces, not including cemeteries and airports, but focusing on recreational areas like golf courses and open parks and ball fields that have a lot of open space in proximity to developed areas that could potentially, you could think about modification for storing floodwaters temporarily in the event of a storm. So these opportunities popped out as potentials in Winthrop. And so thinking about back to the idea of developing a work statement, you could think about concept planning for coastal flood management. And you'd need to investigate flow paths, storage capacity, and community interest in future open space amenities as you were starting to think about whether taking that project to the next step. This is an interesting case study along those lines. This is Moakley Park in Boston. This was funded by an MVP action grant. They're looking to do preliminary design, technical analysis, and pre-permitting to take this existing park and really incorporate a lot of community feedback about how they'd like to use the park and design a coastal flood storage nature-based solution. So this is an interesting case study. Then staying on the coast, I wanted to look at Edgartown, which is in Martha's Vineyard. And their MVP planning report had a priority action to create a comprehensive conservation and protection plan for wetlands and waterways in 2019. And I think the Woods Hole Resource Group did this report. So I just wanted to harken back to what I was saying earlier about how interactive this process is. It's not the cleanest map here on the bottom left, but you can see that's participatory markup. So that's people who live in Edgartown looking at maps and saying, this is where it currently floods, and this is why it's a problem, and this is what we anticipate will happen if and when this flooding gets worse, as a way to sort of access these kind of complex set of problems and work towards solutions. Anyway, that was a little bit of a digression. So we're looking for conservation and protection for wetlands and waterways. So again, thinking about the maps, we turn on the inland flood hazard layer and see what that looks like in Edgartown. I won't go through all of the data layers again this time. And we would also take a look at the coastal flood hazard layers. So I mentioned this already, but the criteria here is the NOAA SLOSH impacted areas for category 1 and 2 hurricanes. And that will be updated by ADCIRC, which is the model I described, the probabilistic model for the coast. Next, we can turn on the inland flood resilience layers and look for opportunities to conserve for inland flood resilience. So these are opportunities, again, it's unprotected, undeveloped open space that, if protected, could protect against the impacts of existing and future flooding. Something that I haven't mentioned yet, but that I think is going to be relevant for these maps is that as municipalities think about build out analysis and zoning for the future, that's another potential use for these maps. So if you have an area that is providing you with inland flood resilience, you want to conserve it to retain that resilience, but also you want to conserve it because you probably don't want people living in that floodplain in the future, especially as impacts come more and more. So then within this category of inland flood resilience, we also have the restore inland flood resilience and connectivity. There's a couple of things that roll up into that. So we look for potential wetland restoration opportunities just by looking at the layer of converted wetlands that Mass DEP has available online and statewide. I think that this is kind of a conservative layer. I think it misses some converted wetlands. I think maybe their baseline is recent. So just to note that if you are going to use these and you want to think about wetland restoration and it doesn't pop up here, that might happen. The other option is riparian zone restoration. So we looked for cold water fisheries. We looked for developed riparian areas along cold water fisheries as places where you could get good benefits from a reforestation process. And then thinking about connectivity, we have the Division of Ecological Restoration's restoration potential model, which scores all of the dams across Massachusetts. So we listed any dams in the top 25%. And we looked at culverts with poor aquatic passage according to UMass's critical linkages database. And there's pretty decent evidence that culverts that have poor aquatic passage also have low resilience to storm impacts. So that's all the stuff that's in the inland flood resilience layer. And then we also have one more thing that I think you'd look at to try to explore that priority action from Edgartown is the coastal flood resilience actions. So there's Conserve for Coastal Flood Resilience, which again is unprotected, undeveloped open space within the coastal flood hazard, and the Adapt for Coastal Flood Resilience, which I talked about already for the Winthrop example, but I didn't have the data up on the screen. So this is where we're looking for opportunities to capture floodwaters, developed open spaces. So with all those things, we can then hop back into these online maps. So this is Edgartown. The greens are pretty similar. I apologize for that right now, but you can see there's a decent amount of conservation opportunity along the waterways here that overlap with the either inland flood or coastal flood hazard. And again, just sort of thinking about co-benefits and building a potential request for funding, I would turn on this the biodiversity co-benefit layer and think about where you might be able to layer up the opportunities to retain resilience and protect biodiversity benefits. So a potential action grant opportunity could be to explore with an inventory of conservation opportunities for wetlands and waterways to retain and enhance coastal resilience and enhance biodiversity co-benefits. So here's an example that was funded by the MVP program in Mattapoisett to conserve 120 acres of forests, streams, freshwater wetlands, and coastal salt marsh in the Pine Island Pond area of Mattapoisett. As I understand it, this project was designed with the idea of retaining existing coastal flood resilience and also, as I mentioned before, preventing future development from occurring in these high-risk areas. So that one was funded just within the last year, I believe. And then another action grant that could be relevant to these layers, as I mentioned, is thinking about how you zone within these hazard footprints. So Boston is developing its first ever resilient building code so that development in future floodplain is prepared for at least 3 feet, of sea level rise, which is the likely scenario by late century. So that kind of work is also eligible for action grant funding. And having run through those few examples, that's all I've got prepared. So we have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. And I do just want to one more time make a plug that if you are tempted at all to play around with these or thinking about an action grant submission, please, and you have any questions with it, feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really fantastic. And we do have a couple questions and we do have some time, so please keep submitting them. I wanted to mention first, we did get a question related to when the slides might be available and a recording of the webinar. So the snepnetwork.org website that you saw in the beginning of the presentation from Leah, that will be where we post the final video recording of the webinar, and you will also receive an email shortly after the webinar ends with a link that will be live within the next 48 hours that will include the video recording. So getting right into the questions, Sarah, this first question is asking about floodplain easements. So the question is, have you incorporated consideration of how floodplain easements might need to change to catch up with and maintain riverine meanders? And as a side note, the asker of this question also said they have heard that Vermont has developed something called a rolling easement that would address something similar to this concern.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. So I have not spent a lot of time yet exploring exactly how you might incorporate this information into different easements or zoning areas, but that's something that I hope to do. I know that Vermont, one of the state agencies in Vermont has mapped and managed, I believe, what they call the meander zone, which is an area where the river might meander. And I think that they have great control there and ability to review projects and think about where people might be vulnerable, not just for how the river is currently, but how it might meander through time. There is, in our consideration of inland flood hazard, we do have a product called the Active River Area, which is a more inclusive look at the portion of a river that contributes sediment and materials and is broader than just a static 100-foot buffer. I couldn't say for sure. I don't think we have anything quite as sophisticated as that meander belt that Vermont has, but it's a great point to keep in mind as we talk with communities that especially are curious about exploring ordinances, that not only is flooding going to change, but you should keep the meander in mind. That's a great point. Thank you.
Great. And then the next question, switching gears slightly, the asker of this question wants to know if you can share a little bit more about the carbon sequestration layers that you're thinking about.
Yes, yep, that is a good question. And actually, this project is not going to have that incorporated in this iteration. I'll tell you when I know, with the caveat that I don't work for the state and I'm less involved in this project. But Massachusetts is part of the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is an alliance. Last I heard, we were at 28 states. I don't know, it may be more, of states that have committed to meeting the Paris Accord agreement, even though the federal government has backed away from that. And as part of the climate work that the state government is doing in Massachusetts, they have a team that's working on their Global Warming Solutions Act. And as also, as part of being a U.S. Climate Alliance state, I think that they're in the process of figuring out how they want to incorporate carbon stocks in existing ecosystems into their carbon budget for their Global Warming Solutions Act goals, which is a series of goals to get us down to I think zero emissions eventually. But again, that's not my main focus. But anyway, that work is happening outside of our product. So at some point, we may be able to point to work that's being developed for the state for their roadmap to 2050, which is another sort of acronym and program, all targeting emissions mitigation. But we aren't duplicating that effort here. So I could potentially try to find some resources to share what the state's thinking to go out in a day or two from the Technical Advisory Network. But again, that might get incorporated later when the state is ready with their information.
That is a lot of useful context. I think that makes sense, and the uncertainty there is also makes sense to me. Again, switching gears, we're kind of going all over the place here, but it's good. What kinds of nature-based solutions are being considered in the Moakley Park case study? And can you tell us a little bit more about that project and how we can learn more? Yeah,
that's one that I'm not directly involved in. this is another link that I could share with Leah and Tess when they send out the slides. But Moakley Park has its own website, I think, that you can get to from the city of Boston, and they've even made like a little promo video about it as a superhero for the neighborhood. And I don't even remember which firm is doing the design, but I believe the intent is to help impact, so to attenuate waves, and I think there's an intent to sort of prevent the water from getting out of the park and maybe slow it. But again, I'm less involved, so sorry, I can just share another link on that one.
That sounds great, and we can definitely get those all these links marshaled together. So this is next question goes back to the beginning of your presentation. And you had mentioned that communities in the MVP use the Community Resilience Building workshop to start the process. Can you tell us a little bit about that workshop? Can communities not in the MVP also use it? And how is it useful for identifying different hazards and vulnerabilities?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. So the Community Resilience Building framework is a product of the Nature Conservancy. It was developed first in Connecticut, but it's been now rolled out, I think, in hundreds of places, including potentially someday in Hawaii, which I'm trying to position myself as vital for that effort. But it has its own website, so I can put a link to that also in our follow-up information, and it's free. So there's when you go to the website, what you get is there's like a 30-page guide for how you can phase and facilitate the workshops, and there's this matrix that allows you to be very, actually, you're all still looking at my screen, right?
Yes.
So one of my examples had the matrix in it. Here. The template for these matrices is there as well. So the way Massachusetts has chosen to organize its grant program, the planning grant program, is that the municipalities get together and they invite community members to participate in a conversation. And the first thing you do together is identify the top hazards that the municipality, or it doesn't, also like Tufts has done it, colleges do it, regional groupings do it, I think staff have done it, so it doesn't have to just be a municipality, but whoever you're working with gets together and identifies their top priority hazards that have impacted them in the past. So things like precipitation, wind, fire, heat, drought, coastal flooding sometimes, ice storms sometimes. And then you give the community a little bit of information about climate projections for their area and how to think about what those climate projections mean relative to historic natural hazards. Then you break out into groups, and the groups sit around a map of their community, and hopefully they have some floodplain maps, and if it's coastal you can have sea level rise maps, and you give them that kind of information, and then you have a facilitated conversation about what the town's assets are. So in the category of infrastructure, society, and the environment. So, you know, people talk about a range of things like parks and the fire department and a low-lying road and a hazardous dam, and all of that gets listed along this, along the left-hand column. And then you indicate where it is in town, who owns it, and if it's a vulnerability or a strength. And then after that, what you do is you go across, and relative to each hazard, if you have different actions for each hazard, you come up with an action statement, an action item that either bolsters a weakness or strength, or makes a strength stronger. And then once you have all your actions written out, you go through and you prioritize, is that a high, medium, or low priority? And is it something that could be done in the short term, long term, or is it an ongoing project? And then specifically for the MVP program, actually, no, everybody writes a report. Then the consultant writes a report, and you work together. The last bit of facilitated work is to identify the top 3 or 4 actions, but all the matrices and maps from each group are incorporated into the report. So it's a real record of the conversation, including sort of the result of the facilitated conversation about priorities. And all of that, like guidance for doing, I think all of that is on the Community Resilience Building website, and it is free. Adam Walchel is the person at TNC who created this framework, and he's always willing to talk with folks about how they might incorporate it in their city or county or state or whatever. So you can reach out for that too.
It's fantastic. It sounds like a great planning blueprint to really get started. So again, next question, back to the tool itself. Do you need any specific software requirement? Are there software requirements for using it? And do you need a GIS expert in order to, expertly manage the tool and use it?
Yeah, it's a good question. No, especially not with the online version. Like I said, I didn't want to drive this live because I don't trust my Wi-Fi, but when you're live in here, all you have to do to sort of toggle between these different action layers is to click on the little circles, and it'll do that for you. There's a search up here where you can search for your location, and there's also a link to a little report for the thinking behind this, so you can get some background if you need it. And there's a little bit of description of what goes into the layers. If you are live, you can kind of hover over it. So no, intentionally, there's a lot of different layers that you can turn on and off, but beyond that, we wanted people to just sort of be able to play around at a pretty easy level.
Great. So it sounds like all you really need is an internet connection. And for those interested, there's going to be a link to this website in the follow-up email that will be sent out shortly after the webinar ends. So I think we do have time for just one more question. And I think one thing that would be great for you to comment on, Sarah, is, how can communities use this tool, outside of just the MVP? Is this tool something that folks can use to help with other types of planning, like hazard mitigation planning? Are there other sorts of funding and financing opportunities that would be good to consider when you can use a tool like this for?
Yes, yeah, that's a good question. I think that beyond the MVP program, there's opportunity to think about zoning options for the future. I think I mentioned that briefly, but thinking about long-term resilience, if you could look across your municipality for areas that are currently undeveloped and unprotected, and in an area that's projected to have hazards, and think about how you want to encourage development away from those areas potentially. That's one way. I think that the MS4 permits, so the permits that govern the separate storm sewer systems that I think like 250 communities in Massachusetts are subject to, is an interesting potential use for this tool as well. And even just thinking about, like, as you update your open space plan or your master plan or your hazard mitigation plan, I think all of those planning exercises could be informed by this if you wanted it to. Part of the reason that it's positioned right now through the lens of MVP is A, that the action grants are live, and B, that it's a pretty inclusive footprint. And we did that on purpose. We didn't want communities to feel like they had limited options, so if you were going to poke around in there for something outside of MVP, it's good to think like, so think about what you want. And if you're looking for conservation opportunities, maybe you first look at all the land that the municipality owns. That would be, or I guess that wouldn't be a conservation opportunity, but you kind of look through the lens of what you're thinking about doing. It would be a way to access this, I think. But yeah, I think it has potential and could also be used to help justify a hazard mitigation grant.
Awesome. So it sounds like that's a great place to stop for the day. Sarah, I'd like to turn it back over to you to see if you have any other closing comments. And I think we're pretty much winding down.
Great. No, I don't think I do. Just well, except for thank you all for joining and sticking through the hour, and don't feel shy if you're using these and you have a question to reach out.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, everybody, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.